My name is Harper Noble, and I was 26 the afternoon I stood in my parents' driveway and watched them sell my entire portfolio for $12. My mother handed 14 of my original canvases to a local junk dealer to make room for my older brother's new home gym. When I tried to pull them back, she laughed. She told the dealer it was just a child's scribble, not real art, and that I needed to grow up and get a real job. They took the $12 and drove to the corner store to buy a case of cheap beer. I stopped painting that day. I traded my own brushes for the quiet, invisible work of fixing other people's masterpieces. 6 years later, my phone rang with a Los Angeles number. It was a senior appraiser from Sotheby's. The junk dealer had not thrown my scribbles away, and by the time my parents realized what they had done, they had already perjured themselves into a federal fraud investigation, trying to steal it back. Welcome back to QE Told Stories, where we sit with the quiet women who keep their dignity when the people closest to them decide to turn. No shouting, no revenge plots, just women who know exactly what they are worth. If that is the kind of story you came for, tell me your age in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe because this one took me years to be ready to tell. I built a meticulous, quiet life for myself as an art restorer in a small, sunlit studio in Los Angeles. For 6 years, my daily routine consisted of breathing life back into cracked 19th century oils and smoke-damaged portraits. I was the person galleries trusted to repair mistakes. I found a certain peace in the background. It felt safe. If you never create anything new, nobody can sell it for pocket change. My parents, Brenda and Tom, lived a few hours away. They viewed my restoration work the exact same way they viewed my original paintings. They called it my hobby shop. They only reached out when a bill was due or when my older brother Julian needed a financial bridge. Julian was the golden child. I was the silent bank. That was the dynamic, and I had accepted it because arguing with Brenda was a game nobody won. The status quo broke on a Tuesday afternoon. I was using a cotton swab to lift a century of grime off a landscape when the studio phone rang. The woman on the other end introduced herself as a senior appraiser for the Sotheby's Los Angeles auction house. She asked if I was Harper Noble, the original creator of a 14-piece collection dated between 2010 and 2016. I set my cotton swab down. My hands went cold. I told her those pieces were gone. She corrected me in a calm, professional tone. The junk dealer had recognized the quality of the canvas and sold the entire lot to an eccentric local millionaire. That millionaire had just passed away. His estate was putting my 14 pieces up for a high-profile autumn auction. The appraisal estimate was $2.5 million. I sat in my studio chair and watched the Los Angeles traffic move outside my window. The air in the room felt very thin. The appraiser kept speaking, outlining the legalities of the lake collector's will. He had been a champion of undiscovered talent. His estate stipulations required a 20% direct royalty paid to the original artist upon formal authentication. That meant I was required to come in, verify my signatures, and claim $500,000. It was a windfall that would launch a fine art career I had buried 6 years ago. I thanked the appraiser. I wrote down the appointment time on a plain sticky note. I hung up the phone and went back to cleaning the landscape painting. I did not post on social media. I did not call my mother. I kept the secret locked in my chest. I knew from years of experience that the familiar demanding rhythm of my phone would return soon enough. I just needed to decide what I was going to do the next time my family asked me to open my wallet. 2 days after the phone call from the auction house, my morning began in the quiet dark of my apartment. The sun had not yet risen over Los Angeles. My coffee was still brewing when the familiar rhythm of my phone vibrated against the kitchen counter. It was a specific pulsing pattern I had learned to dread over the past 6 years. My mother did not believe in greetings. She did not ask how my restoration projects were going or if I had slept well. The text message that illuminated my screen was a raw demand. Julian needed $15,000 by the close of business tomorrow. The message stated he had fallen behind on the mortgage for his Pasadena home, and the bank was threatening to issue a public notice. Julian was my older brother, and the perpetual golden child of the Noble family. He lived in a sprawling historic craftsman house framed by manicured oak trees and wrought iron gates. He drove leased luxury sedans and wore tailored suits to his VIG consulting job. His entire existence was a carefully curated performance of wealth. He was married to a woman named Maya. Maya was a commercial architect who spent her days designing downtown high-rises. She was sharp and pragmatic and operated in a world of blueprints where every structural load had to be accurately calculated. Maya earned an excellent income and believed Julian matched her financial contributions. She was entirely unaware of the deep structural flaws in her own household. She did not know her husband routinely missed his share of the bills, or that he used his younger sister as a private slush fund to hide his financial gaps. For 6 years, I had served as the silent bank for my family. Whenever Julian spent beyond his means, he called our mother. Brenda would then call me, weaving tales of temporary cash flow issues and bad investments. She would remind me that family took care of family. I paid the property tax deficits. I covered the surprise country club dues. I funded the gap when Julian wanted to take Maya on an anniversary trip to Italy without admitting his accounts were overdrawn. I had always complied because it was easier than fighting the combined force of my parents' disappointment. They routinely belittled my career in art restoration, referring to my studio as a hobby shop. They treated my income as unearned excess that rightfully belonged to the son who had a real image to maintain. I stood in my kitchen and looked at the text message. Before the appraiser contacted me, I would have felt the familiar tightening in my chest. I would have opened my banking portal and drained my savings to protect my brother's pride. But the math had changed. I looked at the plain sticky note I had brought home from the studio. It bore the date of the upcoming estate sale and a staggering estimate of $2.5 million. I picked up the phone. I did not type a paragraph explaining my budget. I did not apologize or ask for more time to gather the funds. Armed with the knowledge of my true worth, I typed 2 letters and hit send. No, I set the device face down on the granite counter and poured my coffee. The refusal sparked an immediate digital firestorm. Less than 30 seconds later, my phone began to ring. The caller identification flashed my mother's name. I let it ring until it rolled to the answering service. She called a second time, then a third. The screen lit up with incoming text messages, but I ignored those as well. I carried my mug into the living room and watched the early morning light catch the dust motes in the air. When the calls finally ceased, the voicemail notifications appeared. I sat on my sofa and pressed play. Brenda's tone shifted rapidly across the 3 recordings. The first message was laced with frantic confusion. She assumed I had made a typographical error or misunderstood the urgency of Julian's situation. She explained that Maya was reviewing the quarterly household budget this weekend, and Julian needed the $15,000 deposited before she noticed the missing mortgage payments. The second message arrived 2 minutes later. The confusion had curdled into anger. My mother demanded I pick up the receiver. She reminded me of all the sacrifices they had supposedly made for my upbringing. She listed my perceived failures and questioned my loyalty. The third message was a masterclass in cruelty. Brenda dropped any pretense of maternal affection. She called me a selfish, ungrateful woman. She stated that I was a failed artist who spent her days cleaning up the work of talented people because I lacked the skill to create anything of my own. She said keeping my money hoarded in a bank account while my brother faced public humiliation was an unforgivable betrayal. She told me to transfer the funds immediately, or I would no longer be welcome in their home. I listened to every word without shedding a single tear. 6 years ago, those words would have broken me. I would have internalized the insults and written the check just to earn back a fraction of her approval. Now the insults simply felt hollow. They were the desperate tactics of a woman realizing her primary revenue stream had dried up. I did not argue. I did not draft a defensive text message outlining how much I had already given them. Arguing provides the opposition with material to twist. Silence offers them nothing. Instead of defending myself, I opened my laptop. I logged into my business and personal banking portals. I navigated to the transaction history tab and set the filter parameters for the past 72 months. I pulled every wire transfer, every cleared check, and every digital payment I had routed to Julian's accounts. The final tally was sickening. Over 6 years, I had quietly handed over more than $80,000 to maintain my brother's lifestyle. I downloaded the financial statements as encrypted files. I created a dedicated digital folder on my desktop and named it Pasadena. I transferred the banking records into the file. Then I connected my phone to the computer. I exported the 3 hostile audio recordings Brenda had just left me and saved those into the folder alongside the receipts. I archived the original text demand for the $15,000. I am a restorer by trade. My entire profession revolves around preserving evidence and cleaning away the layers of dirt to reveal the truth underneath. I was simply applying my professional skills to my personal life. I secured the documents onto an external drive and placed it inside a fireproof lockbox hidden in my closet. I spent the rest of the day working in my Los Angeles studio. I repaired a tear in a canvas and matched the original pigment of a painted sky. My phone remained silent. The quiet did not signify peace. I understood the psychology of my family well enough to know the confrontation was not over. By withholding the financial compliance they felt entitled to, I had lit a fuse. Brenda and Julian operated on a foundation of control, and my sudden boundary threatened to collapse their entire structure. Maya would be returning from her architecture firm on Friday evening to review the Pasadena household budget. Julian was running out of time to hide his negligence. A text message refusal would never be accepted as the final answer. They needed the cash, and they needed a target for their frustration. As I cleaned my brushes and locked the studio doors that evening, I mentally mapped out their next move. They would not respect the boundary of a digital screen. They would view my silence as an invitation to escalate. I walked to my car, knowing with absolute certainty that the digital harassment was merely a prelude. They were going to drive down the coast. They were going to bring the demands directly to my physical doorstep. The air inside my Los Angeles workspace always smelled of turpentine and aged varnish. It was a controlled environment where temperature and humidity were monitored to preserve fragile histories. I stood over a drafting table examining a 19th century maritime landscape under a magnifying lamp. The canvas suffered from decades of neglect. Dark layers of oxidized resin obscured the details of a painted harbor. I dipped a fine pointed brush into a specialized solvent, applying it to a single square inch of the dark sky. The process required intense focus. One wrong movement could strip away the original pigment and ruin the underlying masterpiece. I appreciated the quiet precision of my craft. The outside world rarely penetrated the heavy wooden doors of the gallery. My receptionist, Elena, guarded the front desk with a polite but firm gatekeeping protocol. She managed demanding collectors and impatient curators, ensuring my focus remained unbroken. That morning, the protocol failed. The heavy wooden door swung open so hard the brass hinges rattled. Elena appeared in the frame, looking flustered. She started to apologize, stating she tried to stop them, but the intruders simply pushed past her desk. I waved Elena away, assuring her it was fine, and instructed her to return to the front. Brenda and Julian stepped into my sanctuary. They had driven 2 hours down the coast to bring their digital demands into my physical reality. My older brother wore a custom navy blazer and expensive leather loafers. At first glance, he projected the image of a successful corporate consultant, but his posture betrayed him. His shoulders carried a rigid tension, his jaw clenched and unclenched. Maya would be home in less than 10 hours to review their household budget. Julian was cornered, and a cornered man operates on pure desperation. My mother marched in behind him. She carried her designer handbag like a weapon. She did not bother to survey the delicate artwork surrounding us. She saw my career as a menial labor job. To her, this was not a professional studio. It was just a room where her disappointing daughter played with paint. She started talking before the door even clicked shut. Her voice echoed against the brick walls, shattering the peace. She demanded to know why I was ignoring my phone. She insisted I write a check for $15,000 immediately. She framed the demand as an emergency, pointing to Julian's stressed expression as proof of his suffering. I did not raise my head. I kept my eyes on the maritime canvas. I rolled the cotton swab over the solvent, lifting away a strip of yellowed grime to reveal a vibrant blue sky beneath. I placed the soiled swab into a disposal bin and selected a clean one. My refusal to engage infuriated her. Brenda was accustomed to an audience. She expected tears. She wanted me to scramble, apologize, and open my checkbook to alleviate the discomfort of her shouting. When I provided nothing but steady breathing, she amplified her tactics. She stepped closer to my work table, attempting to use physical proximity to intimidate me. She called me stubborn. She labeled my refusal a deliberate act of sabotage against my own blood. She launched into a familiar tirade about my wasted potential. She reminded me that I had squandered whatever minor talent I possessed as a child to become a glorified janitor for other people's art. She listed Julian's fabricated accomplishments, painting him as the pillar of our family who deserved my unconditional financial support. While she delivered her monologue, I noticed Julian moving out of my peripheral vision. My brother was a scavenger by nature. Whenever he entered a room, he instinctively scanned for leverage. He paced along the perimeter of my workspace, trailing his fingers over the edges of stacked canvases and supply crates. His eyes darted around, looking for anything he could use: a bank statement, a client invoice, any piece of paper indicating I possess liquid cash. My desk sat in the corner of the room. It was organized and uncluttered, save for a single item resting near the keyboard. It was a heavy, thick folder made of premium cream cardstock. The front cover bore the deep embossed logo of the Sotheby's auction house. Brenda raised her voice higher, drowning out the ambient noise of the city outside. She demanded I look at her when she was speaking. She leaned over my drafting table, her shadow falling across the fragile oil painting. I kept my hands perfectly steady. I applied another drop of solvent to the canvas. I knew if I reacted to her insults, I would lose the high ground. I let her talk. Under the cover of her loud guilt-tripping, Julian stopped at my desk. He stared at the embossed logo. His expensive shoes made no sound on the polished concrete floor as he reached out and casually flipped the heavy cover open. I saw the movement in the reflection of my magnifying lamp. The contents of that folder were not encrypted. The appraiser had sent over the preliminary estate documents via courier the previous afternoon. The top page was a formal assessment summary. It detailed the 14 original canvases titled The Noble Collection. The bold black ink spelled out the estimated auction valuation of $2.5 million. Highlighted directly beneath that figure was the binding legal stipulation. The original artist was guaranteed a 20% direct royalty upon authentication. Julian stood frozen. His eyes tracked back and forth across the page, reading the numbers. $500,000. I set my cotton swab down. I turned away from the drafting table and walked toward the desk. My footsteps were slow and deliberate. I did not rush. Rushing would signal panic. I reached the desk and placed my hand firmly over the open document. Julian looked up. The fabricated panic over a missed mortgage payment vanished from his face. It was replaced by a cold, calculating hunger. He stared at me with an expression I had never seen him wear before. It was the look of a predator who had just discovered a feast. I slid the document out from under his gaze. I closed the heavy cream cover. I opened the top drawer of my desk, dropped the folder inside, and turned the brass key, locking it. I slipped the key into my apron pocket. My brother did not say a word. He did not demand an explanation. He did not ask about the auction house or the 14 childhood paintings he had watched our parents sell for beer money 6 years ago. He possessed all the information he needed. Brenda was still ranting near the drafting table, unaware of the silent exchange that had just occurred. She was in the middle of a sentence about how I owed them my livelihood when Julian abruptly turned his back to me. He walked over to our mother and grabbed her arm. His grip was tight enough to wrinkle the fabric of her blouse. He interrupted her mid-sentence and stated they were leaving. Brenda blinked in confusion. She dug her heels in, demanding to know why they were giving up. She pointed at me, insisting they needed the $15,000 before Maya checked the accounts. Julian pulled her toward the heavy wooden doors. He told her the $15,000 no longer mattered. His voice lacked its previous desperation. It carried a chilling calm. He pushed the door open and dragged her out of the gallery, leaving the sudden silence to settle over the room like dust. I stood alone in my sanctuary. The scent of linseed oil and turpentine offered no comfort. The boundary I had set that morning had worked exactly as I intended. It had drawn them out and forced them to reveal their tactics. But Julian opening that folder changed the entire landscape of our conflict. My brother had arrived seeking a temporary bailout. He departed, possessing the blueprints, to a fortune. I understood the danger immediately. My family had spent my entire life using emotional exploitation to drain my resources. But emotional exploitation relies on guilt and obligation. What Julian just discovered required a different approach. The dynamic had officially shifted from petty manipulation to calculated financial predation. They were no longer going to beg for crumbs. They were going to orchestrate a campaign to seize the entire bakery. I did not waste time trembling. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket and dialed a direct line I rarely used. Evelyn answered on the second ring. She was a seasoned art attorney and my trusted mentor. She operated a boutique legal firm catering to high-net-worth collectors and vulnerable creators. She had taught me the legal mechanics of the fine art world. She possessed the instincts of a shark wrapped in designer silk. I told Evelyn about the ambush. I detailed the exact document Julian had read. I explained the 20% royalty clause and the $2.5 million valuation of the Noble collection. Evelyn did not offer useless sympathy. She asked one pointed question. She wanted to know if my family possessed any leverage to claim copyright or physical ownership over the artwork. I stared at the locked drawer containing the Sotheby's folder. I told her the pieces were painted under their roof when I was barely 20. Evelyn instructed me to gather every receipt, text message, and voicemail I had archived. She told me to prepare a flawless paper trail. We had to anticipate their next maneuver before they executed it. Julian knew about the money, and a man like my brother would not keep that secret to himself. He would share the discovery with Brenda and Tom. They would construct a narrative to insert themselves into the auction. I hung up the phone and looked back at the fragile maritime painting on my drafting table. The dark layers of grime were stubborn, but they could always be removed with the right solvent and a steady hand. My family was about to attempt the largest theft of my life. I picked up a clean brush, ready to strip away their lies. The weekend following the studio ambush stretched out in a tense quiet. Evelyn had warned me to prepare a flawless paper trail, and her legal advice echoed in my thoughts. I spent Saturday organizing my restoration supplies and reviewing the Pasadena file. I knew Julian and Brenda were not remaining idle. My older brother possessed a distinct predatory intelligence when it came to locating wealth. He held the name of the auction house and the estimated valuation of $2.5 million. That was all the raw data he required to construct a new strategy. Julian always viewed the internet as a weapon. During his university years, he routinely manipulated digital footprints to secure prestigious corporate internships. I anticipated he would apply that identical skill set to my impending windfall. He would scour the upcoming autumn catalogs, cross-referencing the Noble collection with the late collector's estate. He would unearth the glossy digital brochures detailing my 14 childhood canvases. 48 hours after the confrontation, the isolation of my Sunday evening broke. My mobile device vibrated against the glass coffee table. It was not a hostile financial demand from a relative. It was a text message from a prominent local gallery owner named Silas. Silas had purchased my restoration services for years. He also knew my mother. Brenda had cornered him at an independent exhibition 3 years prior, loudly complaining that I was a stubborn disappointment who refused to secure a stable corporate job. Silas sent a hyperlink followed by a single question mark. Before I could tap the address, another notification illuminated the screen. Then a third. Colleagues, acquaintances, and former art school peers began flooding my inbox with congratulations mixed with profound confusion. They asked when my family had become such devoted patrons of my work. I opened my laptop and followed the digital trail Silas provided. It routed me to a popular Los Angeles art community forum. A fresh thread sat at the pinnacle of the page, boasting hundreds of interactions. The author of the publication was Brenda. I clicked the link and read the most polished piece of fiction my mother had ever authored. She had uploaded a faded photograph of me from high school, holding a cheap paintbrush. The caption beneath the image was a masterwork of revisionist history. Brenda described a household overflowing with creative encouragement. She wrote about how she and Tom sacrificed their own modest aspirations, working extra weekend shifts to afford premium oil paints and imported canvases for their gifted daughter. The narrative claimed they recognized my prodigy status early. Brenda stated they carefully preserved my portfolio, protecting those 14 specific paintings from the harsh realities of the world until the right moment arrived. The forum entry was only the initial phase of their campaign. I navigated to her public Facebook profile. She had shared a similar tribute there, tagging dozens of extended relatives and hometown neighbors. The tone was sickeningly sweet. She painted a portrait of a devoted working-class family united by a shared vision of nurturing a fragile genius. The comments section overflowed with unwarranted praise. Distant aunts and old high school teachers lauded my parents for their unwavering dedication to my craft. I read the paragraphs without a spike in my heart rate. The hypocrisy was thick enough to choke on, but I understood the underlying mechanics of her prose. This was not a sudden awakening of maternal pride. This was Julian pulling the strings. My brother understood optics better than anyone I knew. He recognized that a family demanding a cut of a multi-million-dollar estate sale looked parasitic. However, a pair of devoted lifelong managers who sacrificed everything to launch their daughter's career looked entitled to a substantial return on their investment. Brenda was laying the public groundwork to position my parents as my benefactors. By establishing a documented history of financial and emotional patronage, she was building a civil case for a management fee. The average target would have reacted with immediate indignation. A typical daughter would have logged into the forum and initiated a messy public dispute. They would have typed out furious rebuttals, calling their mother a liar for all of Los Angeles to witness. I am not average, and I do not participate in public spectacles. If you correct a liar in a crowded room, you often look just as unhinged as the person you are fighting. Furthermore, demanding a retraction gives the opposition power. It proves their tactics are effective at generating distress. Instead of typing a defense, I engaged the screen capture function on my computer. I meticulously photographed every paragraph, every fabricated claim of buying me premium supplies, and every comment praising their false sacrifices. I archived the time-stamped images into a new encrypted folder. I placed them alongside the audio recordings of Brenda calling me a failed artist just days earlier. The contrast between the private voicemails and the public declarations was stark and legally potent. I poured a glass of cold water and watched the likes and shares climb on her profile. I let them construct their fraudulent house of cards right there in the open. I wanted the public record to be dense and inescapable. When you know the foundation is entirely built on a lie, the smartest maneuver is to let the architect finish the roof before you kick out the support beams. I spent the remainder of Sunday evening watching the Los Angeles art community digest my mother's fabricated narrative. A few prominent gallery directors left supportive comments on her forum post, praising her maternal dedication. They had no idea they were applauding a woman who once sold the very art they were admiring for $12 to purchase a case of cheap beer. I did not reply to Silas or any of the confused colleagues who texted me. Replying would only create a secondary paper trail that Julian could manipulate. Silence remained my most impenetrable defense. The void of my reaction forced my family to keep acting, to keep posting, and to keep generating evidence against themselves. The digital performance lasted through the weekend and into the new week. By Monday morning, the supportive narrative was firmly cemented in our social and professional circles. Brenda was playing the role of the proud manager to perfection. That afternoon, my mobile device rang again. This time, the caller identification displayed my father's name. Tom rarely initiated contact unless he was tasked with delivering an ultimatum or closing a deal Julian had orchestrated. His voice sounded uncharacteristically gentle over the cellular connection. He suggested we all needed a fresh start. He invited me to a private dinner at an upscale seafood restaurant in Beverly Hills. He insisted it was time to put past misunderstandings behind us and celebrate my impending success as a united family. I stared at the encrypted files on my desktop containing his wife's lies. I accepted the invitation, knowing a trap always waits behind a sudden display of affection. The restaurant my father selected was an upscale seafood establishment in Beverly Hills, known for low lighting and exorbitant prices. The dining room smelled of roasted lemon brown butter and expensive cologne. Waiters navigated the floor in crisp white uniforms carrying silver trays. I arrived 10 minutes early, but Tom and Brenda were already seated in a corner booth. My parents looked out of place among the subtle wealth of the room. They had dressed in their finest attire, attempting to project an image of prosperity. Brenda wore a silk scarf she reserved for weddings, while Tom sported a tailored suit he had not worn in a decade. My father spent his career as a regional sales director for a mid-level manufacturing firm. He viewed every interaction as a zero-sum negotiation, where a victor and a loser had to be established. He believed deeply in the power of a firm handshake and formal paperwork, assuming that younger generations were easily intimidated by bold ink. When I approached the table, their performance began. Brenda stood up to embrace me, offering a manufactured warmth that felt entirely foreign. Tom smiled and gestured for the waiter, ordering a round of premium scotch and a towering selection of imported oysters. They were celebrating. They ordered the most expensive items on the menu, operating under the long-standing family tradition that their successful daughter would eventually cover the tab. I ordered a glass of sparkling water and sat across from them, observing the theater. For the first 40 minutes, the conversation remained uncharacteristically sweet. Brenda referenced her recent online posts, speaking as if the fabricated history was established fact. She told me how proud they were to have nurtured my fragile talent and how the upcoming autumn auction was a victory for the entire Noble family. Tom nodded along, swirling the amber liquid in his glass, discussing legacy and the importance of generational wealth. I listened to their revisionist tales without interrupting. I chewed a piece of warm bread and waited for the illusion to drop. The shift occurred precisely before the dessert menus arrived. Tom cleared his throat and wiped his mouth with a linen napkin. The artificial warmth evaporated from his face, replaced by the cold, calculating expression of a salesman ready to close a deal. He reached into his leather briefcase resting on the booth seat and withdrew a thick, heavily stapled document. He placed it next to my water glass and slid it across the smooth wooden table. The bold typography on the cover page read, "Management and Copyright Agreement." I did not flinch. I picked up the thick stack of paper and began reading the clauses. The legal jargon was dense and ruthless, bearing the unmistakable fingerprints of Julian. My brother had clearly outsourced the drafting to an aggressive corporate attorney. The instrument was backdated 6 years to the exact month they had sold my portfolio to the junk dealer. The premise of the agreement was built on an astonishing distortion of intellectual property law. The text argued that because I was residing under their roof and utilizing paints they had allegedly purchased, my 14 original canvases qualified as a work for hire. It classified my parents as my legal managers and sole proprietors of the copyright. I turned to the second page outlining the financial compensation. The terms dictated that I grant them an 80% share of all future royalties stemming from the Noble collection. Furthermore, it required me to surrender all decision-making authority over the Sotheby's authentication protocol directly to Tom. I kept my expression flat. I looked up from the stapled pages. My father was leaning forward, resting his elbows on the table, anticipating a panicked reaction. He expected me to cry or raise my voice in protest. When I remained silent, he delivered the ultimatum. He stated that the paperwork was a formality to ensure the family received its rightful return on investment. He then outlined the alternative. If I refused to sign the contract, he and Brenda were prepared to contact the auction house, the estate executors, and the Los Angeles art press. They planned to publicly disavow the 14 paintings as fakes. They would claim I painted the canvases mere weeks ago in my studio to defraud a deceased millionaire. The threat was surgically precise. A forgery accusation is a lethal weapon in the fine arts sector. My entire professional identity as a restorer was anchored in uncompromising integrity. I handled fragile histories and commanded the trust of elite curators. If a rumor circulated that I fabricated provenance to secure a multi-million-dollar payout, my restoration career would end overnight. No gallery would ever allow me near a historical piece again. Julian had targeted the single asset I valued above currency, which was my reputation. Brenda sipped her martini, observing me over the rim of the glass. She softly suggested that signing the paper was the easiest path forward for everyone. She framed the extortion as a loving compromise meant to protect me from the stress of managing a large fortune. I looked down at the thick document in my hands. The average person might view the contract as a terrifying weapon. I viewed it as a monumental strategic error on their part. In their arrogance and their desperate rush to secure the auction funds, they had committed a critical mistake. They had formalized their blackmail. They had printed their intent to extort a percentage of a multi-million-dollar estate and handed me the physical evidence. I did not throw my water in my father's face. I did not scream at my mother for her betrayal. I simply aligned the edges of the stapled pages. I folded the thick document in half, making a sharp crease down the center. I opened my leather purse and placed the contract inside, letting the brass clasp snap shut. Tom frowned. The confident smirk faded from his lips. He extended his hand across the white tablecloth, demanding I return the paperwork or sign it immediately. I picked up my purse and pushed my chair back from the booth. I kept my voice low and even, ensuring the surrounding diners could not hear a single syllable. I informed my father that I never sign legal instruments without the direct supervision of my attorney. I told him I would require time to review the stipulations with my legal counsel. Brenda dropped her pleasant facade. Her voice grew sharp as she ordered me to sit back down. She reminded me of the forgery threat, stating they would make the phone calls the moment I walked out the door. I stood tall, adjusting the strap of my bag on my shoulder. I looked directly into my mother's eyes and thanked her for dinner. I turned and walked away from the booth. I navigated through the dimly lit dining room, past the silver trays and the wealthy patrons. I reached the exit without rushing my steps. As the valet retrieved my car, I glanced back through the glass windows of the establishment. The waiter had just arrived at their table carrying a leather folio containing a $400 check. Tom was furiously digging through his pockets, while Brenda stared in my direction, her face flushed with sudden panic. They had utilized a maxed-out credit card, expecting the silent bank to cover their indulgence. The bank was officially closed. I drove home through the winding canyon roads feeling a strange sense of calm. The folded paper in my purse was a heavy shield against their impending slander. But my relief was temporary. I knew my brother well enough to understand he never relied on a single strategy. Julian always built a contingency plan in case his initial maneuvers failed. The failed copyright trap would only force him to utilize his secondary option. My phone illuminated in the passenger seat as I parked in my driveway. The incoming message did not belong to my parents or my brother. The notification displayed the name of my sister-in-law. Maya was requesting an urgent coffee meeting before she went to her architecture firm the following morning. The tone of her brief text indicated she had discovered something deeply alarming inside her own household. Julian was already pivoting, and the next layer of his scheme was about to emerge. The morning fog had not yet burned off the Los Angeles skyline when I parked outside a minimalist cafe in the downtown district. The location was halfway between my restoration studio and the towering glass high-rise where Maya worked. My sister-in-law sat at a corner table near the window. A single shot of espresso rested untouched in front of her. Maya operated in a universe governed by physics and undeniable truths. As a commercial architect, she designed structures that required rigid foundations and precise calculations. She did not deal in illusions. If a support beam lacked the required density, a building would collapse. She applied that same pragmatic logic to human behavior. Consequently, she had never fully subscribed to my mother's ongoing narrative about the difficult and unstable daughter. Maya observed how I managed my business, paid my taxes, and maintained a quiet existence. She recognized that the chaos in the Noble family rarely originated from my direction. I slid into the booth across from her. She looked exhausted. The polished, confident aura she usually carried into corporate boardrooms was fractured. Her posture sagged, and dark circles shadowed her eyes. She did not offer a polite greeting or ask about my weekend. She pushed her ceramic cup aside and leaned forward, resting her elbows on the wooden table. Maya spoke in a hushed tone. She explained that Julian had left his synchronized tablet unlocked on their kitchen island late last night. A notification chimed, drawing her attention to the screen. It was a group text thread containing my brother, Brenda, and Tom. Maya admitted she scrolled through the messages out of a lingering suspicion regarding their recent finances. What she discovered shattered her perception of the man she married. She described the digital conversation. Julian was boasting. He was frustrated by my refusal to sign the backdated copyright contract at the seafood restaurant, but he reassured our parents that he possessed a fail-safe strategy. If I continued to deny them the 80% cut of the estate payout Julian intended, to file a petition for an emergency conservatorship. The word hung in the air between us, heavy and toxic. A conservatorship is a legal mechanism designed to strip a person of their autonomy, handing control of their finances and medical decisions over to a guardian. Julian planned to construct a narrative depicting me as a fragile artist, buckling under the psychological strain of sudden wealth and public scrutiny. He intended to use Brenda's recent internet posts, highlighting my supposed lifelong sensitivities as preliminary evidence. My brother had already scheduled a consultation with a predatory estate litigator known for executing hostile wealth takeovers. Maya stopped talking and searched my face for a reaction. She expected tears or a panic attack. She assumed I would crumble under the weight of such profound cruelty. Discovering that your own blood relatives are plotting to legally erase your independence is a heavy burden. It shifts the battlefield from a simple financial dispute to a fundamental threat against personal liberty. I did not cry. I took a slow, deliberate breath and processed the information. My brother was escalating his tactics from extortion to legal subjugation. He wanted to place me in a gilded cage and hold the key. But panic is a useless emotion when facing a calculated predator. Panic obscures logic, and I needed pristine clarity. I looked at Maya. I saw genuine revulsion in her expression. She was an ethical woman who valued fairness and transparency. Reading those text messages forced her to confront the grim reality of her husband's character. He was not the benevolent, successful consultant he pretended to be. He was a scavenger, willing to declare his own sister mentally unfit just to siphon a royalty check. I validated her horror without raising my voice. I thanked her for stepping out of the fog of his lies to deliver the warning. I told her it took courage to betray her spouse's confidence to protect a relative she barely knew. Maya shook her head, staring down at her cold espresso. She whispered that she felt like she was living with a stranger. She explained how Julian had brushed off the missing $15,000, claiming a client payment was delayed. She had believed him because she always believed him. Now she questioned every financial anomaly and every late-night phone call he made to his mother. I knew I had to offer Maya something in return. She had handed me the blueprint to their next attack. I needed to hand her the tools to protect herself. I kept my tone gentle but firm. I asked Maya if she had personally reviewed the deed to their Pasadena property recently. She frowned, confused by the sudden pivot in our conversation. She replied that they purchased the historic Craftsman home together 4 years ago. She assumed everything was standard. I explained that my family relied on a silent banking system for the past 6 years. I told her I was that bank. I did not deliver the information with malice or triumph. I stated the numbers like an accountant reviewing a ledger. I revealed the $80,000 I had transferred to cover Julian's hidden deficits. I mentioned the surprise country club dues, the property tax gaps, and the anniversary trip to Italy that he could not actually afford. Maya's eyes widened. The color drained from her cheeks as the arithmetic clicked into place. The structural integrity of her marriage was failing. I leaned closer across the small cafe table. I advised her to skip her morning meetings and drive directly to the county clerk's office. I told her to request the physical title documents and the current mortgage statements for her home. I warned her that a man willing to forge a copyright contract and plot a fraudulent conservatorship against his sister would not hesitate to take out a secret second mortgage against his own house. She did not argue. The architect inside her recognized a failing foundation when she saw it. Maya understood that numbers do not lie, even if husbands do. She stood up from the booth. She gathered her leather portfolio and her car keys. Her hands were shaking slightly, but her jaw was set with a new, hardened resolve. Maya had arrived as a confused spouse seeking to share a disturbing secret. She was departing as a silent observer residing inside the enemy camp. She promised to keep her eyes open and her mouth shut while she investigated her own financial exposure. I watched her walk out of the cafe and disappear into the bustling morning pedestrian traffic. I remained in the booth for another 10 minutes, drinking my water and contemplating my next move. Julian was preparing a devastating legal strike. Filing a conservatorship required presenting evidence of instability to a judge. He would need to manufacture a crisis or provoke me into a public meltdown to solidify his case. I realized my strict silence was infuriating him, but it was also starving him of the ammunition he required for a courtroom. I walked out to my car with a renewed sense of purpose. I had to contact Evelyn immediately. We needed to fortify my medical and financial records to render any claim of mental incompetence laughable. However, I also knew Julian was impatient. Legal petitions took time to draft and file. He was desperate for cash right now. If the conservatorship proved too slow or too difficult to execute, he and Brenda would pivot again. They would search for a faster, more direct method to freeze the auction funds before Sotheby's could authenticate my work. The battle for my autonomy was brewing, but a darker, more immediate threat to the artwork itself was already taking shape on the horizon. 2 days after my early morning coffee with Maya, the atmosphere in my studio felt deceptively calm. I had spent 48 hours fortifying my position against the threatened conservatorship she had warned me about. I contacted my primary care physician and a clinical psychologist requesting copies of my own medical histories. I secured formal letters from both professionals attesting to my pristine mental health and my capacity to manage my own affairs. I assumed my brother was busy drafting complex legal petitions that would take weeks to file in a probate court. I underestimated his impatience and his desperation for immediate liquid cash. A conservatorship was a slow, grueling process. Julian required a faster weapon. The quiet rhythm of my workday was interrupted when Elena walked into my workspace holding a thick manila envelope. The heavy paper bore the red stamped insignia of certified legal mail. It was addressed directly to me with a carbon copy designation printed at the bottom, indicating the exact same packet had been routed to the primary legal department at the Sotheby's auction house. I wiped the linseed oil from my hands using a clean rag and signed the courier's electronic pad. The letterhead embossed at the top of the pages belonged to a prestigious Century City litigation firm. Julian had clearly leveraged another maxed-out line of credit or promised a percentage of the eventual payout to secure a ruthless corporate shark. I unfolded the heavy bond paper and read the opening paragraph. It was a formal cease and desist order. My parents had officially petitioned the auction house to halt the upcoming autumn sale of the Noble collection. The second page detailed the justification for the injunction, and the sheer audacity of the lie forced me to sit down on my wooden stool. Brenda and Tom were no longer claiming they were my devoted, lifelong managers. They had discarded the backdated copyright contract the moment I refused to sign it at the Beverly Hills restaurant. They were now utilizing a far more dangerous legal strategy. The document asserted that the 14 canvases were never sold to a local buyer. The new official narrative claimed the artwork was stolen from our family garage 6 years ago. The litigation firm wove a masterful, tragic narrative depicting my parents as devastated victims of an unreported residential burglary. The text specifically painted me as a naive, emotionally fragile youth who lacked the worldly experience to understand that a crime had even occurred. The lawyers argued that because the property was stolen, the deceased millionaire's estate possessed no legal right to auction the pieces. A thief cannot pass a clean title to a buyer, even an oblivious one. Furthermore, the document designated Tom and Brenda as the rightful sole owners of the recovered stolen property, seeking immediate restitution. Their demand was breathtaking in its calculated greed. They were no longer trying to extort 80% of my artist royalty. They were seeking to seize the entire $2.5 million estate payout, completely bypassing my involvement. The letter demanded Sotheby's freeze the authentication protocol, withhold all payments to the estate, and transfer the anticipated funds into a newly established family trust, pending a full investigation. The named executor of that proposed trust was Julian. My brother had engineered a method to swallow the entire fortune while keeping his own name off the initial accusation. I did not wait for the end of the business day. I placed the cease and desist order into my leather bag, locked my studio, and drove directly to Evelyn's office in downtown Los Angeles. Her firm occupied the 34th floor of a sleek glass tower overlooking the sprawling grid of the city. The environment was sterile and precise, a stark contrast to the colorful, organized chaos of my restoration studio. Evelyn sat behind a polished marble desk, wearing a sharp charcoal suit. She took the document from my hands and read it in total silence. When she finished reviewing the final page, she set the paper down and folded her hands. She did not sugarcoat the severity of the situation. She explained that my family had just executed a brutal legal escalation. They had crossed the boundary from a civil contract dispute into alleging a criminal theft. Evelyn detailed how the fine art market operates on a foundation of pristine provenance. Auction houses are notoriously risk-averse entities. They despise clouded titles and legal ambiguity. The mere whisper of stolen property is usually enough to freeze an auction indefinitely. Sotheby's would not risk selling stolen goods to international buyers. Evelyn leaned forward and outlined my parents' specific gamble. She explained that they were weaponizing time and legal fees against me. They knew a formal investigation into a 6-year-old alleged burglary would take months or even years to resolve. During that prolonged period, the paintings would sit, locked in a dark, climate-controlled vault. The immense momentum and public interest surrounding the auction would wither and die. My family was betting their entire future on the premise that I possessed zero proof of the original transaction. My father had always operated under the assumption that ordinary people threw away their paperwork. Throughout my childhood, Tom negotiated cash deals with local mechanics and neighborhood handymen specifically to avoid leaving a paper trail. He believed cash was a ghost, and transactions without receipts could be rewritten whenever convenient. He assumed I was just a weeping 26-year-old girl the afternoon they handed my canvases to the junk dealer. Who keeps a receipt for a $12 cash sale meant to purchase cheap beer? They were banking on my inability to prove how the paintings left the garage. Evelyn clarified their ultimate goal. They did not actually want to go to trial over a fabricated burglary. Trials require sworn testimony and rigorous cross-examination. They simply wanted to apply unbearable, suffocating pressure. They expected me to cave to the legal intimidation, rather than endure a drawn-out public investigation that would drain my savings and attorney fees. They anticipated I would eventually break down and beg for a private settlement, allowing Julian to take the lion's share of the money just to make the nightmare end. It was the same strategy they had employed for 6 years on a much grander scale. Create a crisis and wait for Harper to pay the bill. I looked at the Los Angeles skyline through Evelyn's floor-to-ceiling windows. I felt a cold, steady rhythm taking over my pulse. I had spent my life cleaning up their messes. but I refused to let them paint me into a corner of their own design. I told my lawyer that we were not going to offer them a settlement. We were not going to negotiate with extortionists. I instructed Evelyn to draft a holding response to the Sotheby's legal department. I needed her to assure the auction house that we possessed definitive physical proof to clear the title and that they should not delay the autumn catalog printing. I drove back to my studio as the afternoon traffic thickened on the freeway. I knew my legal shield was holding firm for the moment, but a formal letter from an attorney would not satisfy my mother's need for control. Brenda was a woman who thrived on an audience. She had tasted the intoxicating power of public sympathy during her initial fabricated Facebook posts, where she played the supportive patron. A private cease and desist letter, sealed in a manila envelope, offered her no social currency. She needed the world to view her as a victim and me as a villain. I understood that the legal maneuvering was only half of their strategy. If they wanted to force me into surrendering the funds, they had to destroy my reputation outside the courtroom. They had to make my professional life in the tight-knit Los Angeles art community unbearable. The stolen property narrative was too dramatic and too lucrative for Brenda to keep contained within the sterile walls of a Century City law firm. I parked my car and stared at the dark screen of my mobile device, knowing the quiet was about to break. The legal paperwork was filed, but the public smear campaign was already being drafted. The holding response Evelyn drafted performed its job flawlessly. Sotheby's legal department received our firm assurance that the title to the artwork was clean, and they declined to freeze the upcoming autumn auction. The corporate attorneys at the auction house recognized a baseless extortion attempt when they saw one. They informed Julian's hired litigator that without formal police documentation or a court injunction, the sale would proceed as scheduled. My brother had expected his aggressive cease and desist letter to function as a magic wand that would immediately halt the machinery of the estate sale. When the corporate lawyers brushed his threat aside, his strategy of securing fast cash hit a solid brick wall. My family realized the private legal route was going to require extensive litigation and profound financial investment. They possessed neither the patience nor the actual capital to sustain a prolonged courtroom battle. They needed a cheaper, faster weapon to force my surrender. Brenda understood that if she could not win in a closed legal setting, she would have to wage the war in the court of public opinion. Throughout my childhood, my mother had reigned supreme over our local hometown gossip network. She utilized whispered half-truths in church parking lots and supermarket aisles to control the social hierarchy of our neighborhood. Whenever someone slighted her, she destroyed their reputation with a few well-placed, sympathetic tears. Los Angeles was a much larger and more complex arena, but the mechanics of character assassination remain identical, regardless of the geography. She just required a louder megaphone to project her fiction across the city. She found her perfect platform in a prominent digital publication dedicated to the Southern California fine art scene. The blog was notorious for prioritizing sensational industry drama over genuine artistic critique. The senior editor was a writer who thrived on scandal and unverified rumors. Brenda reached out to him and granted an exclusive recorded audio and text interview. The resulting article was published on a Thursday morning. It was a masterclass in calculated emotional manipulation. The headline painted a devastating portrait of a loving, working-class household shattered by a mysterious burglary. Brenda spun a tragic tale detailing how she and Tom had saved every spare dollar to foster the talents of their gifted child prodigy. She described the 14 paintings as priceless family heirlooms that had been stolen from their humble garage 6 years ago. The narrative then pivoted to attack my character with surgical precision. Brenda wept during the audio segments embedded in the article. She accused me of abandoning my roots and becoming corrupted by the shallow greed of the Hollywood lifestyle. She claimed I was now colluding with elite auction house executives to fence the stolen heirlooms. She framed the entire upcoming Sotheby's sale as a criminal enterprise designed to cut my impoverished parents out of their rightful legacy. She used specific terminology like fencing stolen goods and fraudulent provenance and corporate collusion. Those complex legal phrases did not originate from my mother's vocabulary. They carried the distinct linguistic signature of my brother. Julian had clearly scripted her performance, feeding her the exact buzzwords necessary to trigger outrage within the art community. The publication did not bother to contact Evelyn or me for a verifying statement before pushing the article live. By noon, the story had circulated through every gallery curator network, independent artist forum, and private collector group chat in the county. The digital spread was swift and merciless. The fallout materialized before I even finished my lunch. My boutique restoration studio had maintained a pristine 5-star rating for years. We built our reputation on quiet discretion and flawless repair work. Suddenly, hundreds of 1-star reviews flooded our business page. Strangers who had never stepped foot inside my workspace left scathing paragraphs accusing me of operating a criminal fencing operation. They called me a thief, a fraud, and a disgrace to the artistic community. The digital assault quickly translated into physical tension. Elena, my receptionist, spent the early afternoon fielding hostile phone calls from outraged readers. One anonymous caller threatened to throw red paint across our gallery windows. Elena was a tough woman, but the sheer volume of the hatred rattled her. I told her to unplug the main phone line and lock the heavy wooden front doors. I sent her home with paid leave for the rest of the week, assuring her that this storm would eventually pass. I remained in the studio alone. The silence of the locked gallery was heavy. I needed coffee, so I walked down the block to the local cafe I visited every single day. The barista, who usually smiled and asked about my current restoration projects, handed me my paper cup without making eye contact. As I walked out, I heard the distinct sound of hushed whispers rippling through the line of customers. The social isolation had begun. I was no longer the respected, invisible restorer. I was the viral villain of the Los Angeles art scene. The true cost of Brenda's campaign struck the following morning. A prestigious private collector who had retained my services for 3 years called my cellular phone. He sounded deeply apologetic, but his tone was firm. He was withdrawing a lucrative contract to restore a series of 19th century European portraits. He explained that his board of directors could not tolerate the negative optics associated with my current public scandal. A few hours later, a local museum director emailed me to indefinitely postpone our scheduled consultation regarding a smoke-damaged landscape. The director stated they could not risk their institutional reputation by associating with a vendor accused of dealing in stolen cultural property. My income stream was drying up rapidly. Clients were fleeing to avoid the collateral damage of my family drama. This was the exact pressure point Julian and Brenda intended to strike. They understood that my restoration business was my sole source of survival. By systematically destroying my professional credibility, they were executing a financial siege. The classic and expected response to this level of social destruction is panic. The targeted individual usually issues a frantic public apology, pleading for understanding. Or, more often, they quietly contact their extortionists and offer a substantial payoff to stop the bleeding and retract the defamatory statements. Julian was likely sitting in his Pasadena home, waiting for my desperate phone call. He anticipated I would offer him half of the auction proceeds, just to make the blog post disappear and save my business. He expected me to fold under the suffocating weight of the public shame. Instead, I provided them with ruthless, impenetrable silence. I did not draft a defensive statement for my social media channels. I did not hire a public relations firm to mitigate the damage. I did not call my mother to scream at her for destroying my livelihood. Reacting to a smear campaign only feeds the fire and gives the opposition the attention they crave. It validates their tactics. I walked into my locked studio every single day. I kept my head down and focused my attention on the canvases that remained on my drafting table. I mixed my solvents, matched my pigments, and repaired the broken art in front of me. I let the rumors swirl outside my brick walls. I also utilized my computer. I printed the entire blog post, including the comments section. I downloaded the audio snippets of my mother's tearful interview. I archived every single canceled client contract and every hostile review left on my business page. I added all of this new evidence to the encrypted digital file located on my external drive. I wanted Brenda's loud, emotional narrative to cure like concrete. When a person tells a lie in private, they can easily backtrack or alter the details if they are challenged. But when a person broadcasts a lie to a massive public audience and records their own voice making the false claims, they lock themselves into a permanent, inescapable cage. Brenda had just handed me a verified, published record of her own defamation. She had bet her entire strategy and her public reputation on the assumption that I possessed zero physical proof of the day they cleared out my bedroom. Julian and Tom were absolutely certain that the events of that afternoon 6 years ago were lost to memory and emotion. They assumed I was just a weeping, naive girl who failed to document the worst day of her life. They had forgotten the fundamental truth about my character. I was a professional archivist long before I ever restored my first painting. The public record was now set in stone, and it was finally time to retrieve the one piece of evidence that could shatter their entire concrete foundation. The digital smear campaign raged across the city, rendering my professional life unrecognizable. But my mind remained untouched by the current panic. While former clients canceled contracts and strangers left hostile reviews, I found myself retreating to a humid Tuesday afternoon 6 years ago. The blog post, authored by my mother, relied entirely on a fabricated narrative of a residential burglary. She painted a picture of a loving home invaded by unknown thieves. The reality of how my 14 canvases departed our property was far more mundane and infinitely more cruel. 6 years prior, Julian had decided to embrace a new fitness regimen. He lived in a sleek apartment at the time, but he convinced our parents that he required a dedicated, professional-grade home gym to maintain his corporate image. Brenda and Tom eagerly volunteered my bedroom and the adjacent garage space for his equipment. I was 26 years old, living at home while working minor apprentice jobs to launch my fine art career. My parents considered my presence an inconvenience, and they viewed my extensive portfolio as a collection of worthless clutter taking up premium square footage. They did not hire a professional moving service. My father contacted a local neighborhood clearance dealer named Marcus, who drove a rusted white utility van and purchased scrap metal and discarded furniture. I stood in the driveway that afternoon, watching my mother drag my original canvases out to the cracked concrete. These were not quick sketches or amateur doodles. They were large-scale oil paintings that required hundreds of hours of painstaking labor. They represented the culmination of my teenage years and early adulthood. Brenda told the dealer the canvases were just child's play and requested he haul them away to a landfill. Marcus was a businessman, accustomed to finding hidden value in suburban trash. He examined the sturdy wooden frames and felt the texture of the thick canvas. He did not care about the artistic merit, but he recognized raw materials. He offered my parents a flat rate of $12 for the entire lot. Brenda accepted the cash without a single second of hesitation. She turned to my father and cheerfully announced they were going to drive to the corner store to purchase a case of cheap beer to celebrate clearing the room. The standard public narrative suggests I stood in the driveway and wept uncontrollably as my dreams were carted away. I did shed tears that afternoon because the betrayal was sharp and sudden. However, tears have never clouded my practical judgment. Even at 26, I possessed the meticulous, calculating nature of a professional archivist. I understood the fundamental mechanics of human behavior. I recognized that a financial transaction was occurring, and transactions require documentation. My father always mocked my inherent need to keep records. He called it bureaucratic nonsense. He navigated his entire life executing under-the-table cash deals to avoid leaving a paper trail. He believed that cash was a ghost, and any exchange lacking a printed receipt could be rewritten or denied whenever convenient. He assumed I was just a hysterical girl paralyzed by grief. He was incorrect. I wiped my face and ran back inside the house. I opened the kitchen drawer where Tom kept his miscellaneous supplies and retrieved a standard yellow legal pad alongside a black ballpoint pen. I walked back out to the driveway just as my parents were opening the doors to their vehicle. I stepped directly in front of the car blocking their exit. I held out the yellow paper and the pen. I kept my voice surprisingly steady. I told them if they were going to sell my life's work for pocket change, they were going to sign a formal receipt. I had drafted a crude but legally binding bill of sale right there on the cardboard backing of the pad. The handwritten text was precise, leaving zero room for creative interpretation. The sentence read, "We, Tom and Brenda Noble, acknowledge the sale of 14 canvases painted by Harper Noble to Marcus, the dealer, for the total sum of $12, relinquishing all ownership to purchase beer. Signed and dated." Tom laughed loudly. He thought I was performing for attention. Brenda rolled her eyes, sighing heavily, and called me a drama queen. But they were thirsty, and they wanted to leave for the liquor store. Tom snatched the black pen from my fingers and scribbled his distinct, hurried signature across the bottom line. He handed the pen to my mother. Brenda signed her name right next to his, adding a mocking little drawn smiley face to humor my supposed tantrum. They handed the yellow pad back to me without a second glance. They drove away with their $12. I watched Marcus load the 14 canvases into his rusted van and drive in the opposite direction. I took the yellow legal pad, walked into my newly emptied bedroom, and packed my belongings into duffel bags. I moved out of their house 3 days later, and I never painted an original piece again. The memory faded back into the quiet reality of my Los Angeles apartment. The art blog claiming my work was stolen property remained open on my computer screen, glowing in the dim light. My parents had built their entire multi-million-dollar extortion campaign on the foundational assumption that the yellow legal pad did not exist. They assumed I had thrown it away in a fit of depressive grief. They forgot that a restorer never discards the original material. I pushed my chair back from the desk and walked into my bedroom. I opened the sliding doors of my closet and knelt on the hardwood floor. I moved a stack of heavy winter sweaters aside, revealing a thick steel fireproof safe bolted directly into the floorboards. I entered the 6-digit numeric combination and listened for the heavy mechanical click. The steel door swung open. The interior held my passport, my business incorporation documents, and a single clear archival sleeve. I pulled the plastic sleeve out and carried it to the kitchen counter under the bright overhead lights. I slid the yellow legal pad out of its protective casing. The paper was perfectly preserved. The cheap yellow dye had not faded in 6 years. The black ballpoint ink remained crisp and undeniable. The text I wrote on that humid afternoon stared back at me, carrying the weight of a loaded weapon. I studied their signatures. Tom's arrogant scrawl and Brenda's looping cursive with the cruel smiley face mocked me from the past. But they also secured my future. This was the exact kind of paper trail my father used to ridicule. He believed his cash transaction left no footprint. This single sheet of cheap paper was the definitive proof that the Noble collection was legally sold. It was not stolen. There was no residential burglary. The formal police report they were inevitably going to file to satisfy the auction house would be a documented, verified lie. Holding the legal pad, I felt a profound sense of tranquility replace the lingering stress of the social smear campaign. The tool required to dismantle the Century City litigator's entire strategy was resting in my hands. The physical evidence was pristine. However, my legal mentor Evelyn had taught me to think like a prosecutor. If I scanned this receipt and emailed it to Sotheby's today, my family would simply pivot yet again. Julian would pivot instantly. He would claim I forged their signatures. Brenda would invent a new tearful story to feed the local art blog, suggesting I forced them to sign it under duress. They would locate a new angle to attack my credibility, and the exhausting cycle of extortion would continue indefinitely. To defeat a dedicated scavenger, you cannot just swat them away with a single piece of paper. You must let them walk willingly into a trap they cannot escape. I needed my parents to lock themselves into their false narrative so deeply that pivoting became a literal criminal offense. I needed them to commit to the theft story on the official public record in front of corporate witnesses. I took the yellow legal pad and carefully placed it back into the archival sleeve. I returned it to the fireproof safe and spun the dial, sealing the evidence in the dark. The social smear campaign was functioning exactly as Julian planned. He believed the isolation was crushing my spirit and draining my resources. I decided the most strategic maneuver was to let him keep believing his brilliant plan was working. A predator is most vulnerable when they believe their prey has given up the fight. I walked back to my computer desk and closed the art blog. I opened a new blank email draft addressed directly to my brother. It was time to play the role of the defeated, broken daughter. It was time to invite my family to a formal mediation where I would pretend to surrender everything they ever wanted. The following morning, I scheduled a secure video conference with my attorney. Evelyn sat in her downtown office framed by the expansive Los Angeles skyline. I sat in my quiet apartment with the fireproof safe locked securely in the adjacent room. I explained my discovery regarding the yellow legal pad. I described the handwritten bill of sale, the exact wording I had utilized, and the mocked signatures my parents had applied 6 years prior. Evelyn did not smile or offer premature congratulations. She possessed the calculating mind of a chess grandmaster, and she understood that possessing the winning piece was only half the battle. The deployment of that piece determined the ultimate victor. She leaned toward her camera lens and outlined the stark reality of our situation. She explained that presenting the receipt immediately would be a catastrophic tactical error. If we emailed a scanned copy of that yellow pad to Julian's Century City litigator today, my family would not surrender. A scavenger never surrenders. When they are denied a meal, they simply search for a different entry point. Evelyn detailed exactly how my brother would react. Julian would instantly pivot to a fresh lie. He would claim I forged the signatures using my artistic skills. If forgery proved difficult to substantiate, he would argue I coerced my parents into signing a blank document under extreme emotional duress. Evelyn warned me that revealing our evidence prematurely would trap us in an endless cycle of litigation. They would continue inventing new narratives to keep the $2.5 million auction funds frozen in a perpetual legal limbo. To secure a permanent victory, we required Brenda and Tom to lock themselves into a corner they could never escape. We needed them to commit to the stolen property narrative so deeply and so formally that any attempt to pivot would result in immediate criminal prosecution. Evelyn laid out the architecture of our trap. We had to let the antagonists believe their campaign of social destruction was a resounding success. We had to invite them to overplay their hand on the official record. I ended the video call and opened my email client. The cursor blinked on a blank white screen. Writing a message of total defeat required suppressing every instinct I possessed. I had spent my entire adult life defending my independence, but Julian needed to believe he had crushed it. I began to type, carefully selecting the vocabulary my brother craved. I addressed the email to Julian, bypassing the aggressive corporate lawyer he had hired. I kept my sentences short and devoid of any defiance. I wrote that I was exhausted by the relentless public hate generated by the art blog publication. I admitted that the social smear campaign had successfully dismantled my boutique restoration gallery. I listed the lucrative contracts I had recently lost, validating his belief that my financial stability was crumbling. I told him I could not afford a prolonged legal battle over stolen property. I stated that fighting a Century City litigation firm would bankrupt me before the autumn catalog even went to print. I formulated the perfect sentence of surrender. I wrote that I was prepared to attend a formal mediation at the Sotheby's headquarters to relinquish my claim on the Noble collection, allowing our parents to take the settlement they desired. I pressed send before my pride could intervene. The silence that followed was brief. I knew Julian would not reply immediately because responding too quickly betrayed eagerness. He would want to savor his apparent victory. Instead of a reply from my brother, I received a discreet text message from my sister-in-law. Maya was navigating her own precarious reality inside the Pasadena house. She was quietly gathering the mortgage and title documents I had urged her to investigate, unearthing the depth of Julian's hidden debt. She was operating as a silent observer deep within the enemy camp. Her message arrived just after sunset. The text was brief, but it provided the exact intelligence I needed. Maya wrote that Julian was standing in their kitchen holding a glass of expensive scotch. He was on a speakerphone call with Brenda. Maya had listened from the hallway as Julian gloated about my email. He was triumphant. He laughed into the phone, telling our mother that the silent treatment had finally broken my resolve. He mocked my inability to withstand the pressure of public scrutiny, boasting that my lack of response over the past few days was merely a slow psychological collapse. He instructed Brenda to contact Tom and prepare their finest attire for a trip to Los Angeles. They were going to finalize the acquisition of the estate payout. Maya ended her text by confirming Julian was walking into the upcoming mediation expecting a total, unconditional surrender. He believed I was coming to beg for a swift resolution to save my ruined reputation. I thanked Maya for the insight and deleted the message thread to protect her privacy. The trap was officially set. Julian had taken the bait with the predictable arrogance of a man who believed he was the smartest person in any room. He assumed my quiet demeanor equated to weakness. He failed to comprehend that a quiet opponent is often just busy preparing the battlefield. Sotheby's legal department quickly facilitated the mediation request. They secured a glass-walled conference room in their Los Angeles headquarters for the following Thursday. The auction house executives wanted the title dispute resolved swiftly to protect the integrity of their highly anticipated autumn sale. I spent the evening before the mediation preparing my physical presentation. Battles fought in corporate environments rely heavily on visual cues. The clothes you wear dictate the initial power dynamic before a single word is spoken. I did not select a defensive outfit or something that projected vulnerability. I walked to my closet and pulled out a sharp, tailored navy suit. It was a garment woven with precision, featuring clean lines and unyielding structure. I set up an ironing board in my living room and pressed the fabric until every crease was razor sharp. The repetitive motion of the hot iron smoothing the dark cloth felt meditative. It was my armor. When the suit was prepared, I walked back into my bedroom. I knelt on the hardwood floor and opened the heavy steel safe one last time. I retrieved the clear archival sleeve holding the yellow legal pad. The crude handwritten bill of sale and the mocking signatures of my parents waited patiently under the plastic film. I carried the evidence to my kitchen island. I unzipped a sleek black leather portfolio. It was an accessory I reserved for delivering high-value restoration contracts to museum directors. It conveyed professional authority. I slid the archival sleeve into the secure interior pocket of the portfolio, alongside a fresh legal notepad and a silver pen. I closed the zipper, sealing my father's worst nightmare inside. My family had spent weeks attempting to destroy my character. They had lied to the press, manipulated the local art community, and threatened my professional survival. They had demanded a surrender. I was fully prepared to walk into that corporate conference room and hand them exactly what they fought for. I would give them the illusion of total victory. I poured myself a glass of cold water and looked out the window at the glowing grid of the Los Angeles streets. The tension in my chest had evaporated. I was no longer the silent bank or the discarded daughter. I was a professional archivist holding the definitive truth. The next morning, Julian would attempt to force me into signing away my future. He was entirely unaware that I was bringing the one document necessary to initiate his downfall instead. I turned off the apartment lights and went to sleep, ready to face the mediation table. The Sotheby's Los Angeles headquarters occupied a striking architectural footprint in the center of the financial district. The interior was a study in intimidating minimalism. Vast expanses of white marble stretched across the lobby, reflecting the morning sunlight pouring through floor-to-ceiling windows. The environment was engineered to make visitors feel small and deferential to the immense wealth changing hands within its walls. I stepped out of the elevator on the executive floor, wearing my pressed navy suit. The fabric felt like a tailored shield against the clinical chill of the air conditioning. I carried my black leather portfolio gripped loosely in my right hand. Evelyn walked beside me, projecting the quiet authority of a veteran litigator who had navigated these high-stakes corridors countless times. A junior associate guided us toward a glass-walled conference room at the end of the corridor. The transparent barrier offered no privacy from the outside world, ensuring every participant felt the pressure of exposure. My family was already seated around a sprawling mahogany table. They had arranged themselves in a tactical formation facing the double doors. Julian anchored the center of their defensive line. He wore a sharp charcoal blazer and leaned back in his leather ergonomic chair, projecting a curated aura of relaxed triumph. Brenda sat to his right, clutching a designer handbag in her lap. She wore an expression of eager anticipation, resembling a gambler watching a roulette wheel slow down. Tom flanked Julian's left, drumming his fingers against the polished wood, impatient for the financial payout. Maya sat at the far end of the table, separated from the core family unit by an intentional foot of empty space. She kept her eyes focused on her digital tablet, playing the role of the disinterested spouse. Next to Julian sat a man I did not recognize, but whose profession was unmistakable. He possessed the sleek, hungry demeanor of a corporate predator. This was the Century City litigator my brother had retained. His custom suit and silk tie signaled a billing rate that Julian could not genuinely afford. The lawyer introduced himself as Sterling, with a brief, tight smile that never reached his eyes. Evelyn and I took our seats on the opposing side of the mahogany divide. I placed my black portfolio flat on the table, keeping the zipper closed. I did not exchange pleasantries with my mother or father. The silent treatment had brought them here, and I intended to maintain that psychological advantage. Sterling did not waste time with introductory small talk. He possessed the floor, and he intended to dictate the pace of the surrender. He opened a slim manila folder and extracted a single sheet of heavy bond paper. He slid the document across the smooth expanse of the table, stopping inches from my folded hands. He explained that his clients were willing to forgive my prior reluctance to cooperate. He framed the meeting as a generous opportunity for me to walk away from a devastating public scandal. He stated that the document in front of me was a standard waiver of rights. If I signed it, the estate proceeds would be released into a family trust managed by Julian. In exchange, my parents would agree to halt their media campaign and refrain from pursuing civil damages against my restoration gallery. I picked up the document. The text was dense, prioritizing legal finality over plain language. I read the clauses carefully, scanning past the financial forfeiture sections. I was looking for the trap, and I found it, buried in the third paragraph. The document was not merely a financial waiver relinquishing my 20% artist royalty. It contained a specific, sworn, factual declaration. The clause required my signature beneath a statement asserting that I acknowledged the 14 canvases were removed from my prior residence via theft. It demanded I concede that the pieces were stolen property and that my authentication of the work was based on a flawed understanding of the item's provenance. The sheer audacity of the paragraph forced a cold realization to wash over me. Julian's ultimate goal was not just to steal $500,000 from my pocket. He wanted to subjugate my entire future. If I placed my signature on that line, I would be formally admitting that a felony had occurred. By signing a document that diverted insurance funds and estate payouts based on a fabricated crime, I would become an active participant in insurance fraud. I would be committing perjury on the official record of a global auction house. If the truth regarding the $12 transaction ever surfaced, my brother could use this waiver to drag me down with him. My professional credibility would be permanently incinerated. An art restorer who signs fraudulent provenance declarations to facilitate extortion can never touch a historical artifact again. Julian was handing me a loaded weapon and demanding I point it at my own career. I knew the exact performance they required to seal their victory. They needed to see the intimidated, broken daughter they had spent weeks cultivating through digital harassment. I let my shoulders drop slightly, softening the rigid posture of my navy suit. I allowed a slight, visible tremor to enter my hands as I set the paper back onto the mahogany surface. I looked across the table at Julian. I widened my eyes, projecting deep hesitation and manufactured fear. I spoke in a quiet, trembling voice, ensuring the acoustics of the glass-walled room carried my fabricated vulnerability to every person present. I told them I was terrified of the legal implications. I explained that signing a document acknowledging a major theft felt incredibly dangerous without official documentation backing it up. I acted as though the complex terminology paralyzed my decision-making process. I stated that I could not simply sign a waiver based on a verbal narrative. I needed the primary victims of the burglary to take the lead. I locked my gaze onto my mother and lowered my voice to a frightened whisper. I told her I just needed to know she and Dad were taking full legal responsibility for this claim. I requested they formally submit their own sworn stolen property affidavits to Sotheby's and file an official report with the authorities on the public record before I added my name to anything. Sterling frowned, recognizing the bureaucratic delay. He opened his mouth to argue that internal auction house waivers did not require simultaneous police reports to process a civil settlement. But Julian raised a hand, cutting his expensive litigator off before a single counter-argument could be formulated. My brother observed my trembling hands and my lowered voice. His inherent arrogance filtered the visual data, confirming his pre-existing biases. He looked at my manufactured caution and misinterpreted it as profound cowardice. Julian despised administrative delays, and he despised fear. He believed I was buckling under the pressure, seeking a protective shield of official paperwork to hide behind because I lacked the courage to simply execute the deal. Julian leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished wood. He spoke to me with condescending impatience. He called my hesitation a ridiculous bureaucratic hurdle created by a frightened mind. He assured me that filing the official police reports and sworn affidavits was a trivial formality. He turned to Brenda and Tom, his voice dripping with eager greed. He urged his parents to just file the required theft declarations with the auction house compliance officers immediately. He told them to sign whatever sworn statement Sotheby's needed to establish the burglary on the public record. Julian wanted the millions, and he refused to let the timid anxieties of his younger sister slow down the acquisition. Brenda nodded vigorously, agreeing with her golden child. She eagerly assured the room that she and Tom had no problem going on the official record as the victims of a crime. They were so blinded by the proximity of the estate payout, they could not see the architecture of the cage descending around them. I kept my head lowered, maintaining the facade of the intimidated sibling. My hands remained folded in my lap, resting inches away from the closed zipper of my black portfolio. I did not say another word. The trap was no longer just set. Julian had just demanded his own parents step directly onto the trigger. The mediation concluded with my brother dictating the next steps to his own legal counsel. Sterling looked uncomfortable, but he processed the directive because his client promised a lucrative percentage of the estate payout. Julian ushered our parents out of the glass-walled room. He was driven by an intoxicating blend of greed and a false sense of triumph. He believed he had outmaneuvered my caution. He thought forcing them to file the official paperwork would secure the millions and bypass my manufactured anxieties. My family did not return to their respective homes that afternoon. They embarked on a bureaucratic sprint across Los Angeles. Evelyn mapped their movements through the digital filings that hit the Sotheby's compliance portal later that evening. Brenda and Tom visited a certified notary public in the financial district. They sat across a desk from a licensed state official. The notary handed them a standardized affidavit of theft. The text was unambiguous. It required the signatory to declare under penalty of perjury that the 14 original canvases were stolen from a residential property 6 years prior. My parents did not hesitate. Their vision was entirely obscured by the promised wealth hovering just out of reach. They took the pen and signed their names on the dotted lines. The notary stamped the heavy paper with a raised seal. That single physical motion shifted their strategy from a distasteful family dispute into a documented crime. They did not stop at the notary office. Julian insisted they construct an ironclad barrier against any future inquiries. He drove them to a local precinct of the Los Angeles Police Department. My father walked up to the front desk, and requested a supplementary property report. Tom stood in a busy police station and recounted the fabricated burglary to a sworn law enforcement officer. He provided specific dates and described the missing items. The desk sergeant typed the details into the municipal database, generating an official incident number. My parents viewed the police report as a mere administrative hurdle required to satisfy the corporate executives at the auction house. They lacked the legal literacy to understand they had just initiated a fraudulent state investigation. By 5 o'clock that afternoon, Sotheby's received the notarized affidavits and the police incident number. The auction house compliance protocol mandated that all parties involved in the ownership dispute receive copies of the new filings. Evelyn secured the digital scans and forwarded the encrypted packet directly to my personal inbox. While I sat in my quiet apartment downloading the evidence, my family commenced their victory lap. Maya provided a silent, real-time account of their evening through a series of discreet text messages. Julian orchestrated a celebration at a premier steakhouse in Beverly Hills. The restaurant was renowned for its exclusive clientele and exorbitant pricing structure. My brother requested a secluded booth lined with dark leather and polished brass. He was performing the role of the wealthy patriarch, despite carrying immense hidden debts. Maya described the scene with the detached precision of an architect surveying a condemned building. Julian flagged down the sommelier. He ordered 2 bottles of vintage champagne. When the server presented the bill for the beverages, Julian handed over a platinum credit card. Maya knew that specific account was already dangerously close to its limit. He was financing their celebration with phantom money, maximizing his liabilities because he believed the estate payout was guaranteed. Brenda drank the champagne and lost all sense of discretion. She leaned across the white tablecloth and engaged their waiter in loud, boastful conversation. She bragged about her impending fortune. She told the hospitality staff that she was about to receive millions from a legendary art sale. She claimed the money was a long overdue reward for her years of maternal sacrifice. Tom nodded along, slicing into a dry-aged ribeye steak. He toasted his son, praising Julian's strategic brilliance. My father celebrated the acquisition of wealth he did not earn, utilizing a plan that was fundamentally illegal. Maya sat at the far edge of the booth. She declined the champagne. She asked the waiter for a glass of still water with a slice of lemon. She sipped her beverage and observed the delusion unfolding around her. A few days ago, she might have felt a lingering sense of loyalty to her husband. Now, she only felt profound relief that she had visited the county clerk's office. She had verified the secret second mortgage Julian took out against their Pasadena home. She knew the golden child was a hollow shell. She watched him laugh and toast his parents, understanding that he was steering their entire family over a cliff. Maya sent me one final text message before placing her phone in her purse. She wrote that they were toasting to my eventual signature on the waiver. They genuinely believed I was sitting in my apartment, paralyzed by fear, dreading the inevitable moment I had to surrender my rights. I read her message from the comfort of my living room sofa. The contrast between our evenings was stark. They were surrounded by noise, expensive alcohol, and crippling debt. I was surrounded by silence, drinking herbal tea in a home I paid for with honest labor. I opened the encrypted folder Evelyn sent me. I pulled the digital scans onto my large monitor. The resolution was crystal clear. I read the sworn affidavit from Sotheby's legal department. I examined the raised notary seal and the signatures of Brenda and Tom. The ink matched the hurried scrawl on my yellow legal pad perfectly. Next, I opened the supplementary police report. The Los Angeles Police Department logo sat at the top left corner. The incident narrative detailed a fictitious break-in. It listed my father as the primary victim. I felt a cold, steady calm settle over my thoughts. The strategy Evelyn and I engineered had executed flawlessly. My family had overplayed their hand. They possessed multiple opportunities to walk away. They could have accepted my initial refusal to fund Julian's mortgage. They could have retreated when I declined to sign the backdated copyright contract. Instead, they escalated the conflict at every junction, driven by an insatiable hunger for unearned capital. By filing these sworn documents, they crossed an invisible and unforgiving threshold. A civil family dispute regarding shared assets is a messy, emotional affair that courts loathe to untangle. Federal and state fraud, however, is a precise mechanical equation. The justice system does not care about maternal sacrifices or the perceived superiority of a golden child. The system only cares about perjury and false police reports. My parents and my brother had spent the last several weeks constructing an elaborate trap designed to crush my independence and steal my future. I spent the evening reviewing their official paperwork, knowing they had just walked directly into a cage of their own making. I did not need to issue a frantic public apology. I did not need to pay them a settlement to stop the bleeding. I closed the digital files and powered down my monitor. The snare was pulled tight. The only task remaining was the final authentication meeting at the auction house. Sotheby's would require all parties to gather one last time to formally verify the theft claims before transferring the funds into Julian's proposed trust. I knew my family would arrive at that meeting expecting me to finally sign their waiver. They had no idea I was bringing a different piece of paper to the mahogany table. I went to bed knowing the silence was about to end. The morning of the final authentication meeting arrived with a dense, gray overcast blanketing the Los Angeles basin. The weather felt appropriate for the business we were about to conclude. I drove to the financial district in silence, navigating the heavy commuter traffic without any sense of urgency. Evelyn met me in the marble lobby of the auction house. She wore a tailored charcoal blazer and carried a slender leather briefcase. We rode the elevator up to the executive suite without exchanging a single word. We both knew the architecture of the trap was flawless. We only needed to wait for the prey to step onto the final trigger. The corporate conference room was the exact same glass-walled space from our previous encounter. The mahogany table stretched across the center of the room, shining under the recessed lighting. My family was already seated along the far edge, projecting an aura of unearned royalty. Julian anchored the center of their formation. He wore a brand-new tailored suit and a fresh luxury watch. He had clearly financed the expensive garments utilizing his overextended credit lines, assuming the estate funds would clear by the weekend. He sat back in his ergonomic chair, exuding a relaxed arrogance that only a deeply ignorant man could maintain. Brenda sat beside him, wearing heavy perfume and a silk blouse. She looked like a woman who had already spent the millions in her imagination. She smiled at the empty space in front of her, practically vibrating with eager anticipation. Tom drummed his fingers against the polished wood, impatient for the bureaucratic formalities to end so he could claim his prize. Maya sat at the very edge of their grouping. She kept her posture rigid and her eyes focused on a digital tablet. She was no longer a participant in their delusion. She was a silent witness, preparing to exit a collapsing structure. Sterling, the Century City litigator, sat next to Julian with his briefcase open. He possessed the confident demeanor of a lawyer who believed he had successfully bullied his opposition into a lucrative submission. Evelyn and I took our designated seats across the divide. I placed my black leather portfolio onto the table, keeping the zipper securely fastened. A new individual entered the room to officiate the proceedings. He introduced himself as Gregory, the Senior Compliance Counsel for the Sotheby's organization. Gregory was a meticulous man who operated strictly by the letter of the law. He wore wire-rimmed glasses and carried a thick stack of printed documents. He took his seat at the head of the table and pressed a button on a small digital recording device, establishing an official corporate record. Gregory announced that the purpose of this gathering was to finalize the title transfer for the Noble Collection. He stated that the institution had received the notarized affidavits and the supplementary police incident report. He explained that upon verbal confirmation of these documents, the estate funds would be officially decoupled from the original artist and routed into the newly established family trust. The senior counsel looked directly at my mother. He requested that she state her name for the corporate minutes and verbally confirm the events surrounding the loss of the artwork. Brenda did not hesitate. She embraced the spotlight with the practiced ease of a seasoned performer. She leaned toward the center of the table and began to speak. Her voice carried a manufactured tremor designed to elicit sympathy. She wove a heartbreaking narrative detailing a fictitious autumn evening 6 years ago. She described returning to a violated home. She painted a vivid picture of a shattered garage window and a ransacked storage space. She claimed the 14 canvases were stolen by opportunistic thieves who destroyed her daughter's fragile dreams. She squeezed her eyes shut, forcing a single tear to trace a path down her powdered cheek. She concluded her performance by stating that recovering the financial value of those stolen heirlooms was the only way to heal the deep trauma inflicted upon our family. It was a stunning display of calculated deceit. Julian nodded solemnly beside her, playing the role of the supportive son protecting his victimized parents. Tom kept his face somber, validating the fraudulent tale. I sat across from them and watched the performance without interrupting. I did not raise my voice or call her a liar. I let her false narrative hang in the sterile air of the conference room. I allowed the digital device to record every single perjured syllable, locking them into their own fiction. Gregory nodded respectfully, acknowledging her fabricated grief. He turned his attention toward my side of the table. He slid a printed waiver across the mahogany surface. It was the identical document Julian had presented during our previous meeting. The text required my signature, acknowledging the theft and relinquishing my 20% artist royalty. The senior counsel asked if I was ready to concede the title and finalize the settlement. The room went entirely still. Julian leaned forward, his eyes fixed on my hands. He was waiting for me to pick up the silver pen resting on the table. He believed the weeks of social isolation and public defamation had finally crushed my spine. He expected me to sign away my future to stop the relentless pressure. I did not reach for the pen. I reached for the zipper on my black leather portfolio. The metallic sound of the opening zipper seemed exceptionally loud in the quiet room. I reached inside the dark interior and retrieved the clear archival sleeve. I laid it flat on the table. Inside the protective plastic rested the cheap yellow legal pad. Next, I retrieved a secondary manila envelope. 6 years ago, while my parents were driving away to the liquor store, I had not simply walked back inside my empty bedroom to cry. I had stood in the driveway, gripping my cellular phone. I possessed the foresight of a professional archivist. I had photographed Marcus the junk dealer loading my life into his rusted white utility van. I captured his face, his license plate, and the 14 canvases stacked in the cargo bed. I had printed those digital images, anticipating a day when the truth might require visual reinforcement. I extracted 14 high-resolution, zoomed-in photographs from the envelope. Each image bore a verified digital timestamp printed across the bottom corner, matching the exact date and hour of the transaction. I slid the yellow legal pad across the smooth wood directly toward Gregory. I distributed the time-stamped photographs, fanning them out beside the bill of sale. I looked at the senior compliance counsel and requested he read the handwritten text aloud for the official recording. Gregory adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses. He picked up the archival sleeve. He examined the cheap yellow paper. His brow furrowed as he processed the crude ink. The sterile corporate environment amplified the sound of his voice as he read the words I had written 6 years prior. We, Tom and Brenda Noble, acknowledge the sale of 14 canvases painted by Harper Noble to Marcus the dealer for the total sum of $12. Gregory paused. He looked up from the document, his expression shifting from professional neutrality to profound alarm. He looked at my parents and then back down at the paper. He read the final clause aloud. Relinquishing all ownership to purchase beer. He noted the signatures at the bottom of the page. He pointed out the distinct cursive lettering and the mocking smiley face drawn next to Brenda's name. He then picked up the time-stamped photographs, verifying the visual evidence of the transaction. The rusted van, the junk dealer, and the intact garage door were all captured in pristine clarity. The silence that descended upon the conference room was suffocating. It was not the quiet of a peaceful resolution. It was the heavy, crushing void that follows a catastrophic structural collapse. Julian stopped breathing. He sat frozen in his ergonomic chair, staring at the yellow paper as if it were a venomous snake. The arrogant smirk melted off his face, replaced by a hollow shell of terror. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray. He tried to swallow, but his throat was visibly dry. The illusion of his superiority evaporated in an instant. Sterling, the Century City litigator, shoved his chair backward, creating physical distance between himself and his clients. A seasoned corporate predator recognizes a fatal liability immediately. He realized he had just filed a fraudulent police report and submitted perjured affidavits to a global auction house based on the lies of a desperate consultant. His prestigious legal career was suddenly in extreme jeopardy. He glared at Julian with a mixture of pure fury and professional panic. Tom sat with his mouth slightly open, unable to formulate a single coherent defense. His belief that cash transactions leave no footprint was shattered by a piece of stationery he had mocked. Brenda wiped the manufactured tear from her cheek. Her eyes darted frantically around the room, searching for an escape route that did not exist. The public victim persona she had cultivated was dead. Maya slowly powered down her digital tablet. She did not look surprised or distressed. She looked vindicated. She watched the man she married disintegrate under the weight of his own greed, recognizing that she was finally free of his toxic orbit. I kept my posture relaxed. I looked directly into my brother's eyes. I spoke in a calm, level voice, ensuring every word landed with the precision of a surgical blade. They were not stolen. I stated the undeniable fact to the room. You sold them for $12. I shifted my gaze to my parents, who were sinking into their expensive chairs under the crushing reality of their own arrogance. And you just filed a fraudulent police report and a perjured affidavit to extort $2.5 million from an auction house. I did not need to raise my voice to convey the severity of their situation. The documentation did the heavy lifting. I had handed them exactly what they fought for. They wanted to go on the official record. They wanted to swear under oath that a crime had occurred. I simply allowed them to lock the handcuffs around their own wrists before I handed the key to the corporate attorneys. The trap had snapped shut, and the sound of the locking mechanism was the most satisfying noise I had ever experienced. The echo of my statement hung in the sterile air of the conference room. Gregory pushed his wire-rimmed glasses higher up the bridge of his nose. He was a man who spent decades navigating the volatile egos of international art collectors. He had seen sophisticated forgeries and contentious corporate divorces, but witnessing a family execute a documented extortion attempt against their own daughter was a rare occurrence. He did not possess a single ounce of sympathy for the trembling figures sitting across from me. He gathered the time-stamped photographs and placed them neatly beside the yellow legal pad. He turned his attention to Sterling. The Century City litigator was already packing his leather briefcase. Sterling understood the lethal exposure his clients had just created for his firm. Submitting perjured documents to a global auction house is a career-ending maneuver for any licensed professional. Gregory stopped the lawyer before he could stand up. The senior counsel spoke with the detached precision of a surgeon amputating a necrotic limb. He explained the strict institutional protocol regarding fraud. Sotheby's operates on a currency of trust. If prestigious international buyers suspect an auction house tolerates clouded titles or unverified stolen property claims, the entire corporate structure crumbles. Therefore, Gregory outlined their standard procedure for handling verified extortion. He stated that his legal department was prepared to hand the notarized affidavits, the fraudulent police incident number, and my handwritten bill of sale directly to the Los Angeles District Attorney before the close of business today. He clarified that the charges would include felony fraud, filing a false police report, and perjury. The mention of the district attorney sent a physical shockwave through my father. Tom had spent his entire life projecting a facade of rugged independence. He viewed the legal system as something that only entangled other people. Hearing a corporate executive casually discuss referring his actions for criminal prosecution stripped away his remaining bravado. He looked down at the mahogany table, unable to meet my eyes or the gaze of the man threatening him with prison time. Brenda shrank into her seat. The expensive silk blouse she wore to celebrate her impending fortune suddenly looked absurd. Her manufactured victim persona was entirely useless against federal statutes. Evelyn took the floor seamlessly, capitalizing on the terror Gregory had just instilled. She opened her slender briefcase and withdrew a fresh stack of documents. My attorney did not yell or gloat. She offered them an escape route paved with ultimate humiliation. She explained that Sotheby's and her client were willing to forego a criminal referral under 3 non-negotiable conditions. First, they were required to immediately retract the police report, citing a gross misunderstanding of past events. Second, they had to sign an ironclad non-disclosure agreement barring them from ever discussing the Noble Collection, the auction, or my restoration business with any media outlet, gallery, or individual. Third, they would sign a permanent, irrevocable waiver extinguishing any future claims to my artwork, finances, or estate. Evelyn slid 3 heavy pens across the smooth wood. The silver instruments rolled to a stop directly in front of my parents. The choice was binary. They could sign the papers and walk away with nothing, or they could refuse and face a criminal indictment. The silence in the glass-walled room was profound. It was the sound of a toxic dynamic finally snapping. For 6 years, I had funded their mistakes and absorbed their insults. They had utilized loud guilt and digital harassment to force my compliance. Now, confronted with the cold reality of their own handwritten receipt, they possessed 0 leverage. Tom reached for the pen first. His hand shook as he pulled the waiver toward his chest. He did not bother reading the dense legal paragraphs. He understood he was cornered. He signed his name with a jagged, erratic motion, entirely devoid of his usual confident flourish. He pushed the document toward my mother. Brenda picked up her pen. The woman who had proudly broadcast a fictional tragedy to the entire Southern California art scene could not muster a single word in her own defense. She signed the waiver and the strict non-disclosure agreement, leaving the paper stained with a genuine tear of profound defeat. There were no drawn smiley faces this time. Julian stared at the signed papers. The golden child was watching his primary source of unearned income evaporate forever. His elaborate scheme to siphon a $2.5 million payout had collapsed into a pile of worthless liability. The quiet was broken by the sharp snap of Sterling's briefcase closing. The litigator stood up, adjusting his silk tie. He looked down at my brother with sheer contempt. Sterling informed Julian that his retainer agreement contained a strict clause regarding client perjury. Because Julian had facilitated the submission of fraudulent affidavits, the legal representation was officially terminated. However, the outstanding bill for services rendered was due immediately. Sterling cited a figure that made my brother visibly flinch. The lawyer promised to file a lien against Julian's property if the balance remained unpaid by Friday morning. Sterling walked out of the conference room without looking back, leaving his former client drowning in a sea of newly acquired debt. Julian was trapped. The secret second mortgage on his Pasadena home left him 0 equity to borrow against. His credit cards were maxed out from purchasing vintage champagne and tailored suits. The walls were rapidly closing in. My brother performed the only maneuver he had ever known. He turned toward me. The sheer audacity of his pivot was breathtaking. Julian looked across the table, forcing a strained, desperate smile onto his face. He attempted to deploy the familiar, charming tone he used whenever he required a financial bridge. He called my name, utilizing a soft, pleading cadence. He acknowledged that the situation had escalated unnecessarily, but suggested we could still salvage our familial bond. Then he asked the question. He requested a temporary family loan to cover the exorbitant legal fees Sterling had just demanded. He promised to pay me back the moment his consulting business secured a new contract. He had just spent weeks plotting to strip me of my autonomy, my reputation, and my financial future. He had attempted to frame me for fencing stolen goods. Yet, in his twisted reality, he still viewed me as the silent bank. He believed the habit of my compliance was so ingrained that I would reflexively open my checkbook to rescue him from the consequences of his own extortion attempt. I looked at the man who shared my surname. I felt no anger and no lingering obligation. The ledger was permanently closed. I kept my voice flat and even. I told him my bank was closed, I advised him to ask his mother for a loan since she was so adept at managing finances. The rejection landed like a physical blow. Julian's strained smile collapsed, leaving behind a mask of hollow panic. He looked around the room, searching for a lifeline. He turned to Maya. He reached out to his wife, expecting her to offer a supportive platitude or a promise to review their household budget. Maya did not reach back. She sat perfectly still, processing the pathetic display unfolding in front of her. As a commercial architect, she spent her career analyzing stress loads and structural integrity. She had spent the last several days investigating the hidden debts anchored to her own home. She recognized that the man sitting beside her was not a partner. He was a sinkhole designed to consume every resource within his proximity. Maya stood up from the mahogany table. She did not raise her voice or create a dramatic scene. She moved with the calm, decisive energy of a professional executing a necessary demolition. She opened her purse and retrieved her car keys. Then she reached for her left hand. She slid the platinum diamond ring off her finger. The metal caught the recessed lighting as she placed it softly onto the polished wood right in front of Julian. She looked down at him one final time. She stated she was going back to the Pasadena house to pack her belongings. She informed him that her attorney would contact him regarding the impending sale of the property to cover the secret debts he had accumulated. Maya turned away from the golden child and walked toward the double doors. She did not look back at my parents or offer any parting sentiments. She exited the glass-walled room, stepping out into the marble corridor, severing herself from the noble family forever. Julian sat in stunned silence, staring at the discarded ring, knowing the true cost of his greed was just beginning to materialize. The heavy mahogany doors of the conference room clicked shut, leaving Evelyn and me alone in the quiet space. The air inside the executive suite felt remarkably lighter. I stood up and placed the clear archival sleeve containing the yellow legal pad back into my black leather portfolio. I pulled the zipper closed, securing the single piece of paper that had dismantled a multi-million-dollar extortion plot. Evelyn placed a hand on my shoulder, offering a rare, genuine smile before she packed her own slender briefcase. We rode the silent elevator down to the lobby without needing to dissect the victory. The architecture of the trap had performed perfectly. I walked out of the corporate headquarters and stepped onto the sunlit pavement of the financial district. The coastal breeze carried the scent of salt and exhaust, pushing past the towering glass high-rises. For the first time in 6 years, my shoulders carried zero tension. I drove back to my apartment feeling the steady rhythm of a life that finally belonged entirely to me. The consequences of the failed theft claim rippled through my family with devastating speed. Sotheby's legal department demanded an immediate public retraction to clear the title of the Noble collection. Faced with the looming threat of a criminal referral, my parents complied. They forced the prominent Los Angeles art blog to publish a formal correction. The digital publication removed the tearful audio interviews and the tragic burglary narrative. In their place, the senior editor posted a brief, sterile statement acknowledging that the 14 canvases were legally sold to a local dealer 6 years prior and that the previous theft allegations were unfounded. The sudden reversal shattered my mother's carefully constructed social facade. The local art community and our hometown neighbors read the retraction and understood the grim reality beneath the polite corporate language. The supportive comments disappeared from her social media profiles, replaced by an echoing silence. The gallery directors who had praised her maternal dedication realized she had attempted to defraud an estate and ruin her own daughter's career. Brenda and Tom became instant pariahs. The whispered gossip followed them down the aisles of the local grocery store and through the parking lot of their community center. They retreated to the confines of their modest house, unable to face the judgment of a town that possesses a very long memory for hypocrisy. Julian's descent was far steeper and infinitely more permanent. Maya executed her departure with the ruthless efficiency of a commercial architect dismantling a condemned structure. She did not entertain his apologies or his frantic promises to rebuild their finances. She retained a forensic accountant to isolate her personal assets from the hidden liabilities her husband had accrued. She forced the immediate liquidation of the historic Pasadena property. The rapid sale barely covered the secret second mortgage Julian had utilized to fund his illusion of wealth. She packed her belongings into neat cardboard boxes, leaving his tailored suits hanging in a cavernous, empty closet. Without Maya's substantial corporate income sustaining him, Julian could no longer afford his luxury-leased sedans or his elite lifestyle. His consulting firm floundered as the rumors of his fraudulent legal maneuvers circulated through his professional network. Bankrupt and humiliated, my brother packed his remaining possessions. He moved back into my parents' spare bedroom, bringing his staggering credit card debt with him. The golden child was finally forced to live under the same roof as the architects of his ruin, sharing a suffocating reality built on unpaid bills and bitter resentment. While their world collapsed inward, my trajectory expanded outward. The autumn auction arrived in late November. I attended the gala not as an intimidated target, but as the authenticated creator of the evening's centerpiece. The atmosphere inside the Grand Sotheby's exhibition hall buzzed with electricity. Wealthy collectors and international museum curators mingled beneath crystal chandeliers, holding glossy catalogs featuring my childhood work. I sat in a private viewing box and watched the auctioneer take the podium. The bidding for the Noble collection initiated at $1 million. The numbers climbed rapidly, echoing through the cavernous room in a rhythmic, hypnotic cadence. Telephone bidders from overseas competed against determined local buyers sitting in the front rows of the velvet seating area. The initial estimate of $2.5 million was quickly surpassed. I watched the numerical displays on the digital monitors jump in profound increments. The auctioneer raised his wooden gavel and brought it down with a sharp, definitive crack. The final sale price reached $3.2 million. The bulk of the estate proceeds flowed directly to the charitable organizations designated by the late eccentric millionaire. However, the legal stipulations of his will remained ironclad. Within 72 hours of the final gavel strike, the auction house compliance department verified my authentication protocol. My banking application notified me of a pending incoming wire transfer. I opened the digital ledger and stared at a deposit exceeding $640,000. It was a substantial infusion of clean, traceable capital, unburdened by loans obligations or familial guilt. The financial windfall was only the preliminary phase of my triumph. The dramatic narrative surrounding the mysterious prodigy whose lost portfolio resurfaced at a global auction generated intense media fascination. The same Los Angeles art critics who had previously ignored my existence now wrote extensive columns praising the raw emotion captured in those 14 early canvases. The intense publicity acted as a powerful catalyst, skyrocketing the demand for my current creative output. I decided to stop cleaning the faded masterpieces of dead artists. I formally closed my restoration business, returning the final repaired oil paintings to their respective owners. I transitioned my entire focus back to a blank easel. I spent the winter painting a brand new original collection, channeling the quiet resilience of the past 6 years into every brushstroke. I did not need to solicit buyers. The elite gallery directors who had canceled my restoration contracts during the height of the smear campaign now sent lavish floral arrangements and polite emails begging to represent my new portfolio. I declined their offers without hesitation. I selected an independent, prestigious gallery owner who had never doubted my integrity. When my new exhibition opened in the spring, every single piece sold to private collectors before the gallery doors even unlocked for the public reception. I utilized a portion of my clean funds to purchase a sanctuary. I bought a small, beautiful home tucked into the curving roads of the Hollywood Hills. The architecture featured clean lines, natural wood, and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the sprawling valleys below. The property was secluded, surrounded by old-growth trees and high privacy fences. The canyon breeze drifted through the open glass doors, carrying the scent of pine and wild sage. I furnished the rooms with deliberate care, creating an environment that prioritized peace above all other elements. I transformed the expansive sunroom into my primary workspace. The natural light poured through the skylights, illuminating jars of fresh pigment and neatly organized palettes. The heavy scent of turpentine was replaced by the vibrant smell of wet acrylic and raw canvas. My mobile device occasionally illuminated on the wooden drafting table. The caller identification sometimes displayed unknown numbers originating from my hometown area code. My parents and my brother occasionally attempted to breach the boundary they had forced me to build. I imagined they wanted to ask for a temporary loan or deliver a tearful apology to access the wealth they had tried to steal. I never answered the calls. I left the phone on a permanent silent setting, entirely unbothered by the manufactured emergencies of the past. Some ledgers are closed on purpose, and the balance remaining is pure tranquility. I stood in the center of my sun-drenched studio on a quiet Tuesday morning. I wore an oversized linen shirt spotted with fresh paint. I approached a large, stretched canvas resting on a wooden easel. The white surface was a pristine landscape of infinite possibility. I picked up a fine pointed brush and dipped the bristles into a deep cerulean blue. I pressed the color against the fabric, beginning a new chapter. I had secured my home, my career, and my independence. I achieved this victory without shouting, without seeking revenge, and without begging for validation. I survived the loudest people in the room by staying quiet and keeping the receipts.